This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 13. Philistia, be thou glad of me. Grandcourt, having made up his mind to marry Miss Harleth, showed a power of adapting means to ends. During the next fortnight there was hardly a day on which by some arrangement or other he did not see her, or prove by emphatic attentions that she occupied his thoughts. His cousin, Mrs. Torrington, was now doing the honors of his house, so that Mrs. Davilow and Gwendolen could be invited to a large party at Diplow, in which there were many witnesses how the host distinguished the dowerless beauty, and showed no solicitude about the heiress. The world, I mean Mr. Gascoigne and all the families worth speaking of within visiting distance of Pennicote, felt an assurance on the subject which in the rector's mind converted itself into a resolution to do his duty by his niece and see that the settlements were adequate. Indeed, the wonder to him and Mrs. Davilow was that the offer for which so many suitable occasions presented themselves had not already been made. And in this wonder Grandcourt himself was not without a share. When he had told his resolution to Lush, he had thought that the affair would be concluded more quickly, and to his own surprise he had repeatedly promised himself in a morning that he would to-day give Gwendolen the opportunity of accepting him, and had found in the evening that the necessary formality was still unaccomplished. This remarkable fact served to heighten his determination on another day. He had never admitted to himself that Gwendolen might refuse him, but heaven help us all, we are often unable to act on our own certainties. Our objection to a contrary issue, were it possible, is so strong that it rises like a spectral illusion between us and our certainty. We are rationally sure that the blind worm cannot bite us mortally, but it would be so intolerable to be bitten, and the creature has a biting look. We decline to handle it. He had asked leave to have a beautiful horse of his brought for Gwendolen to ride. Mrs. Davilow was to accompany her in the carriage, and they were to go to Diplow to lunch, Grandcourt conducting them. It was a fine mid-harvest time, not too warm for a noonday ride of 5 miles to be delightful. The poppies glowed on the borders of the fields. There was enough breeze to move gently like a social spirit among the ears of uncut corn, and to wing the shadow of a cloud across the soft gray downs. Here the sheaves were standing, there the horses were straining their muscles under the last load from a wide space of stubble, but everywhere the green pasture made a broader setting for the cornfields, and the cattle took their rest under wide branches. The road lay through a bit of country where the dairy farms looked much as they did in the days of our forefathers, where peace and permanence seemed to find home away from the busy change that sent the railway train flying in the distance. But the spirit of peace and permanence did not penetrate poor Mrs. Davilow's mind so as to overcome her habit of uneasy foreboding. Gwendolen and Grandcourt cantering in front of her, and then slackening their pace to a conversational walk till the carriage came up with them again, made a gratifying sight, but it served chiefly to keep up the conflict of hopes and fears about her daughter's lot. Here was an irresistible opportunity for a lover to speak and put an end to all uncertainties, and Mrs. Davilow could only hope with trembling that Gwendolen's decision would be favorable. Certainly, if Rex's love had been repugnant to her, Mr. Grandcourt had the advantage of being in complete contrast with Rex, and that he had produced some quite novel impression on her seemed evident in her marked abstinence from satirical observations, nay, her total silence about his characteristics, a silence which Mrs. Davilow did not dare to break. Is he a man she would be happy with, was a question that inevitably arose in the mother's mind. Well, perhaps as happy as she would be with any one else, or as most other women are, was the answer with which she tried to quiet herself, for she could not imagine Gwendolen under the influence of any feeling which would make her satisfied in what we traditionally call mean circumstances. Grandcourt's own thought was looking in the same direction. He wanted to have done with the uncertainty that belonged to his not having spoken. As to any further uncertainty, well, it was something without any reasonable basis, some quality in the air which acted as an irritant to his wishes. Gwendolen enjoyed the riding, but her pleasure did not break forth in girlish unpremeditated chat and laughter as it did on that morning with Rex. She spoke a little, and even laughed, but with a lightness as of a far-off echo. For her too there was some peculiar quality in the air, not, she was sure, any subjugation of her will by Mr. Grandcourt, and the splendid prospects he meant to offer her. For Gwendolen desired every one, that dignified gentleman himself included, to understand that she was going to do just as she liked, and that they had better not calculate on her pleasing them. If she chose to take this husband, she would have him know that she was not going to renounce her freedom, or, according to her favorite formula, not going to do as other women did. Grandcourt's speeches this morning were, as usual, all of that brief sort which never fails to make a conversational figure when the speaker is held important in his circle. Stopping so soon, they give signs of a suppressed and formidable ability to say more, and have also the meritorious quality of allowing lengthiness to others. "How do you like Criterion's paces?" he said, after they had entered the park and were slacking from a canter to a walk. "He is delightful to ride. I should like to have a leap with him, if it would not frighten mamma. There was a good wide channel we passed 5 minutes ago. I should like to have a gallop back and take it." "Pray do. We can take it together." "No, thanks. Mamma is so timid. If she saw me it might make her ill." "Let me go and explain. Criterion would take it without fail." "No, indeed. You are very kind, but it would alarm her too much. I dare take any leap when she is not by, but I do it and don't tell her about it." "We can let the carriage pass and then set off." "No, no, pray don't think of it any more. I spoke quite randomly," said Gwendolen. She began to feel a new objection to carrying out her own proposition. "But Mrs. Davilow knows I shall take care of you." "Yes, but she would think of you as having to take care of my broken neck." There was a considerable pause before Grandcourt said, looking toward her, "I should like to have the right always to take care of you." Gwendolen did not turn her eyes on him. It seemed to her a long while that she was first blushing and then turning pale, but to Grandcourt's rate of judgment she answered soon enough, with the highest flute tone and a careless movement of the head, "Oh, I'm not sure that I want to be taken care of. If I choose to risk breaking my neck, I should like to be at liberty to do it." She checked her horse as she spoke, and turned in her saddle, looking toward the advancing carriage. Her eyes swept across Grandcourt as she made this movement, but there was no language in them to correct the carelessness of her reply. At that very moment she was aware that she was risking something—not her neck, but the possibility of finally checking Grandcourt's advances, and she did not feel contented with the possibility. Damn her, thought Grandcourt, as he too checked his horse. He was not a wordy thinker, and this explosive phrase stood for mixed impressions which eloquent interpreters might have expanded into some sentences full of an irritated sense that he was being mystified, and a determination that this girl should not make a fool of him. Did she want him to throw himself at her feet and declare that he was dying for her? It was not by that gate that she could enter on the privileges he could give her. Or did she expect him to write his proposals? Equally a delusion. He would not make his offer in any way that could place him definitely in the position of being rejected. But as to her accepting him, she had done it already in accepting his marked attentions, and anything which happened to break them off would be understood to her disadvantage. She was merely coquetting then? However, the carriage came up, and no further tête-à-tête could well occur before their arrival at the house, where there was abundant company, to whom Gwendolen, clad in riding dress, with her hat laid aside, clad also in the repute of being chosen by Mr. Grandcourt, was naturally a center of observation, and since the objectionable Mr. Lush was not there to look at her, this stimulus of admiring attention heightened her spirits and dispersed for the time the uneasy consciousness of divided impulses which threatened her with repentance of her own acts. Whether Grandcourt had been offended or not, there was no judging. His manners were unchanged, but Gwendolen's acuteness had not gone deeper than to discern that his manners were no clue for her, and because these were unchanged she was not the less afraid of him. She had not been at Diplow before except to dine, and since certain points of view from the windows and the garden were worth showing, Lady Flora Hollis proposed after luncheon, when some of the guests had dispersed and the sun was sloping toward 4 o'clock, that the remaining party should make a little exploration. Here came frequent opportunities when Grandcourt might have retained Gwendolen apart and have spoken to her unheard. But no, he indeed spoke to no one else, but what he said was nothing more eager or intimate than it had been in their first interview. He looked at her not less than usual, and some of her defiant spirit having come back, she looked full at him in return, not caring, rather preferring, that his eyes had no expression in them. But at last it seemed as if he entertained some contrivance. After they had nearly made the tour of the grounds, the whole party stopped by the pool to be amused with Fetch's accomplishment of bringing a water lily to the bank like Cowper's spaniel Beau, and having been disappointed in his first attempt, insisted on his trying again. Here Grandcourt, who stood with Gwendolen outside the group, turned deliberately, fixing his eyes on a knoll planted with American shrubs, and having a winding path up it, said languidly, "This is a bore. Shall we go up there?" "Oh, certainly, since we are exploring," said Gwendolen. She was rather pleased and yet afraid. The path was too narrow for him to offer his arm, and they walked up in silence. When they were on the bit of platform at the summit, Grandcourt said, "There is nothing to be seen here. The thing was not worth climbing." How was it that Gwendolen did not laugh? She was perfectly silent, holding up the folds of her robe like a statue, and giving a harder grasp to the handle of her whip, which she had snatched up automatically with her hat when they had first set off. "What sort of a place do you prefer?" said Grandcourt. "Different places are agreeable in their way. On the whole, I think I prefer places that are open and cheerful. I am not fond of anything sombre." "Your place of Offendene is too sombre." "It is rather." "You will not remain there long, I hope." "Oh, yes, I think so. Mamma likes to be near her sister." Silence for a short space. "It is not to be supposed that you will always live there, though Mrs. Davilow may." "I don't know. We women can't go in search of adventures to find out the Northwest Passage or the source of the Nile, or to hunt tigers in the East. We must stay where we grow, or where the gardeners like to transplant us. We are brought up like the flowers, to look as pretty as we can and be dull without complaining. That is my notion about the plants. They are often bored, and that is the reason why some of them have got poisonous. What do you think?" Gwendolen had run on rather nervously, lightly whipping the rhododendron bush in front of her. "I quite agree. Most things are bores," said Grandcourt, his mind having been pushed into an easy current, away from its intended track. But, after a moment's pause, he continued in his broken, refined drawl, "But a woman can be married. Some women can. You, certainly, unless you are obstinately cruel." "I am not sure that I am not both cruel and obstinate." Here Gwendolen suddenly turned her head and looked full at Grandcourt, whose eyes she had felt to be upon her throughout their conversation. She was wondering what the effect of looking at him would be on herself rather than on him. He stood perfectly still, half a yard or more away from her, and it flashed through her mind that a sort of lotus-eater stupor had begun in him and was taking possession of her. Then he said, "Are you as uncertain about yourself as you make others about you?" "I am quite uncertain about myself. I don't know how uncertain others may be." "And you wish them to understand that you don't care," said Grandcourt, with a touch of new hardness in his tone. "I did not say that," Gwendolen replied, hesitatingly, and turning her eyes away, whipped the rhododendron bush again. She wished she were on horseback that she might set off on a canter. It was impossible to set off running down the knoll. "You do care, then," said Grandcourt, not more quickly, but with a softened drawl. "Ha! My whip!" said Gwendolen, in a little scream of distress. She had let it go. What could be more natural in a slight agitation? But this seemed less natural in a gold-handled whip which had been left altogether to itself. It had gone with some force over the immediate shrubs, and had lodged itself in the branches of an azalea half way down the knoll. She could run now, laughing prettily, and Grandcourt was obliged to follow, but she was beforehand with him in rescuing the whip, and continued on her way to the level ground, when she paused and looked at Grandcourt with an exasperating brightness in her glance and a heightened color as if she had carried a triumph, and these indications were still noticeable to Mrs. Davilow when Gwendolen and Grandcourt joined the rest of the party. "It is all coquetting," thought Grandcourt. "The next time I beckon she will come down." It seemed to him likely that this final beckoning might happen the very next day, when there was to be a picnic archery meeting in Cardell Chase, according to the plan projected on the evening of the ball. Even in Gwendolen's mind that result was one of two likelihoods that presented themselves alternately, one of two decisions toward which she was being precipitated, as if they were two sides of a boundary line, and she did not know on which she should fall. This subjection to a possible self, a self not to be absolutely predicted about, caused her some astonishment and terror. Her favorite key of life, doing as she liked, seemed to fail her, and she could not foresee what at a given moment she might like to do. The prospect of marrying Grandcourt really seemed more attractive to her than she had believed beforehand that any marriage could be. The dignities, the luxuries, the power of doing a great deal of what she liked to do, which had now come close to her, and within her choice to secure or to lose, took hold of her nature as if it had been the strong odor of which she had only imagined and longed for before. And Grandcourt himself? He seemed as little of a flaw in his fortunes as a lover and husband could possibly be. Gwendolen wished to mount the chariot and drive the plunging horses herself, with a spouse by her side who would fold his arms and give her his countenance without looking ridiculous. Certainly, with all her perspicacity and all the reading which seemed to her mamma dangerously instructive, her judgment was consciously a little at fault before Grandcourt. He was adorably quiet and free from absurdities. He would be a husband to suit with the best appearance a woman could make. But what else was he? He had been everywhere and seen everything. That was desirable, and especially gratifying as a preamble to his supreme preference for Gwendolen Harleth. He did not appear to enjoy anything much. That was not necessary, and the less he had of particular tastes or desires, the more freedom his wife was likely to have in following hers. Gwendolen conceived that after marriage she would probably be able to manage him thoroughly. How was it that he caused her unusual constraint now, that she was less daring and playful in her talk with him than with any other admirer she had known? That absence of demonstrativeness which she was glad of acted as a charm in more senses than one, and was slightly benumbing. Grandcourt after all was formidable, a handsome lizard of a hitherto unknown species, riot of the lively darting kind. But Gwendolen knew hardly anything about lizards, and ignorance gives one a large range of probabilities. This splendid specimen was probably gentle, suitable as a boudoir pet. What may not a lizard be if you know nothing to the contrary? Her acquaintance with Grandcourt was such that no accomplishment suddenly revealed in him would have surprised her, and he was so little suggestive of drama that it hardly occurred to her to think with any detail how his life of 36 years had been passed. In general, she imagined him always cold and dignified, not likely ever to have committed himself. He had hunted the tiger. Had he ever been in love or made love? The one experience and the other seemed alike remote in Gwendolen's fancy from the Mr. Grandcourt who had come to Diplow in order apparently to make a chief epoch in her destiny, perhaps by introducing her to that state of marriage which she had resolved to make a state of greater freedom than her girlhood. And on the whole she wished to marry him. He suited her purpose. Her prevailing deliberate intention was to accept him. But was she going to fulfill her deliberate intention? She began to be afraid of herself, and to find out a certain difficulty in doing as she liked. Already her assertion of independence in evading his advances had been carried farther than was necessary, and she was thinking with some anxiety what she might do on the next occasion. Seated according to her habit with her back to the horses on their drive homeward, she was completely under the observation of her mamma, who took the excitement and changefulness in the expression of her eyes, her unwonted absence of mind and total silence as unmistakable signs that something unprecedented had occurred between her and Grandcourt. Mrs. Davilow's uneasiness determined her to risk some speech on the subject. The Gascoignes were to dine at Offendene, and in what had occurred this morning there might be some reason for consulting the rector. Not that she expected him any more than herself to influence Gwendolen, but that her anxious mind wanted to be disburdened. "Something has happened, dear?" she began, in a tender tone of question. Gwendolen looked round and seemed to be roused to the consciousness of her physical self, took off her gloves and then her hat, that the soft breeze might blow on her head. They were in a retired bit of the road, where the long afternoon shadows from the bordering trees fell across it, and no observers were within sight. Her eyes continued to meet her mother's, but she did not speak. "Mr. Grandcourt has been saying something? Tell me, dear." The last words were uttered beseechingly. "What am I to tell you, mamma?" was the perverse answer. "I am sure something has agitated you. You ought to confide in me, Gwen. You ought not to leave me in doubt and anxiety." Mrs. Davilow's eyes filled with tears. "Mamma, dear, please don't be miserable," said Gwendolen, with pettish remonstrance. "It only makes me more so. I am in doubt myself." "About Mr. Grandcourt's intentions," said Mrs. Davilow, gathering determination from her alarms. "No, not at all," said Gwendolen, with some curtness and a pretty little toss of the head as she put on her hat again. "About whether you will accept him, then?" "Precisely. Have you given him a doubtful answer?" "I have given him no answer at all." "He has spoken so that you could not misunderstand him?" "As far as I would let him speak." "You expect him to persevere?" Mrs. Davilow put this question rather anxiously, and receiving no answer, asked another. "You don't consider that you have discouraged him?" "I dare say not." "I thought you liked him, dear," said Mrs. Davilow, timidly. "So I do, mamma, as liking goes. There is less to dislike about him than about most men. He is quiet and distingué." Gwendolen so far spoke with a pouting sort of gravity, but suddenly she recovered some of her mischievousness, and her face broke into a smile as she added, "Indeed he has all the qualities that would make a husband tolerable: battlement, veranda, stable, etc. No grins, and no glass in his eye." "Do be serious with me for a moment, dear. Am I to understand that you mean to accept him?" "Oh, pray, mamma, leave me to myself," said Gwendolen, with a pettish distress in her voice. And Mrs. Davilow said no more. When they got home, Gwendolen declared that she would not dine. She was tired, and would come down in the evening after she had taken some rest. The probability that her uncle would hear what had passed did not trouble her. She was convinced that whatever he might say would be on the side of her accepting Grandcourt, and she wished to accept him if she could. At this moment she would willingly have had weights hung on her own caprice. Mr. Gascoigne did hear, not Gwendolen's answers repeated verbatim, but a softened, generalized account of them. The mother conveyed as vaguely as the keen rector's questions would let her the impression that Gwendolen was in some uncertainty about her own mind, but inclined on the whole to acceptance. The result was that the uncle felt himself called on to interfere. He did not conceive that he should do his duty in withholding direction from his niece in a momentous crisis of this kind. Mrs. Davilow ventured a hesitating opinion that perhaps it would be safer to say nothing. Gwendolen was so sensitive, she did not like to say willful. But the rector's was a firm mind, grasping its first judgments tenaciously and acting on them promptly, whence counter-judgments were no more for him than shadows fleeting across the solid ground to which he adjusted himself. This match with Grandcourt presented itself to him as a sort of public affair. Perhaps there were ways in which it might even strengthen the establishment. To the rector, whose father, nobody would have suspected it and nobody was told, had risen to be a provincial corn dealer, aristocratic heirship resembled regal heirship in accepting its possessor from the ordinary standard of moral judgments. Grandcourt, the almost certain baronet, the probable peer, was to be ranged with public personages, and was a match to be accepted on broad general grounds, national and ecclesiastical. Such public personages, it is true, are often in the nature of giants which an ancient community may have felt pride and safety in possessing, though, regarded privately, these born eminences must often have been inconvenient and even noisome. But of the future husband, personally, Mr. Gascoigne was disposed to think the best. Gossip is a sort of smoke that comes from the dirty tobacco pipes of those who diffuse it. It proves nothing but the bad taste of the smoker. But if Grandcourt had really made any deeper or more unfortunate experiments in folly than were common in young men of high prospects, he was of an age to have finished them. All accounts can be suitably wound up when a man has not ruined himself, and the expense may be taken as an insurance against future error. This was the view of practical wisdom. With reference to higher views, repentance had a supreme moral and religious value. There was every reason to believe that a woman of well-regulated mind would be happy with Grandcourt. It was no surprise to Gwendolen on coming down to tea to be told that her uncle wished to see her in the dining-room. He threw aside the paper as she entered and greeted her with his usual kindness. As his wife had remarked, he always made much of Gwendolen, and her importance had risen of late. "My dear," he said, in a fatherly way, moving a chair for her as he held her hand, "I want to speak to you on a subject which is more momentous than any other with regard to your welfare. You will guess what I mean, but I shall speak to you with perfect directness. In such matters I consider myself bound to act as your father. You have no objection, I hope." "Oh dear, no, uncle. You have always been very kind to me," said Gwendolen, frankly. This evening she was willing, if it were possible, to be a little fortified against her troublesome self, and her resistant temper was in abeyance. The rector's mode of speech always conveyed a thrill of authority, as of a word of command. It seemed to take for granted that there could be no wavering in the audience, and that every one was going to be rationally obedient. "It is naturally a satisfaction to me that the prospect of a marriage for you, advantageous in the highest degree, has presented itself so early. I do not know exactly what has passed between you and Mr. Grandcourt, but I presume there can be little doubt, from the way in which he has distinguished you, that he desires to make you his wife." Gwendolen did not speak immediately, and her uncle said with more emphasis, "Have you any doubt of that yourself, my dear?" "I suppose that is what he has been thinking of, but he may have changed his mind to-morrow," said Gwendolen. "Why to-morrow? Has he made advances which you have discouraged?" "I think he began to make advances, but I did not encourage them. I turned the conversation." "Will you confide in me so far as to tell me your reasons?" "I am not sure that I had any reasons, uncle." Gwendolen laughed rather artificially. "You are quite capable of reflecting, Gwendolen. You are aware that this is not a trivial occasion, and it concerns your establishment for life under circumstances which may not occur again. You have a duty here both to yourself and your family. I wish to understand whether you have any ground for hesitating as to your acceptance of Mr. Grandcourt." "I suppose I hesitate without grounds." Gwendolen spoke rather poutingly, and her uncle grew suspicious. "Is he disagreeable to you personally?" "No." "Have you heard anything of him which has affected you disagreeably?" The rector thought it impossible that Gwendolen could have heard the gossip he had heard, but in any case he must endeavor to put all things in the right light for her. "I have heard nothing about him except that he is a great match," said Gwendolen with some sauciness, "and that affects me very agreeably." "Then, my dear Gwendolen, I have nothing further to say than this. You hold your fortune in your own hands—a fortune such as rarely happens to a girl in your circumstances—a fortune, in fact, which almost takes the question out of the range of mere personal feeling, and makes your acceptance of it a duty. If Providence offers you power and position, especially when unclogged by any conditions that are repugnant to you, your course is one of responsibility, into which caprice must not enter. A man does not like to have his attachment trifled with. He may not be at once repelled. These things are matters of individual disposition. But the trifling may be carried too far. And I must point out to you that in case Mr. Grandcourt were repelled without your having refused him, without your having intended ultimately to refuse him, your situation would be a humiliating and painful one. I, for my part, should regard you with severe disapprobation, as the victim of nothing else than your own coquetry and folly." Gwendolen became pallid as she listened to this admonitory speech. The ideas it raised had the force of sensations. Her resistant courage would not help her here, because her uncle was not urging her against her own resolve. He was pressing upon her the motives of dread which she already felt. He was making her more conscious of the risks that lay within herself. She was silent, and the rector observed that he had produced some strong effect. "I mean this in kindness, my dear." His tone had softened. "I am aware of that, uncle," said Gwendolen, rising and shaking her head back, as if to rouse herself out of painful passivity. "I am not foolish. I know that I must be married some time, before it is too late. And I don't see how I could do better than marry Mr. Grandcourt. I mean to accept him, if possible." She felt as if she were reinforcing herself by speaking with this decisiveness to her uncle. But the rector was a little startled by so bare a version of his own meaning from those young lips. He wished that in her mind his advice should be taken in an infusion of sentiments proper to a girl, and such as are presupposed in the advice of a clergyman, although he may not consider them always appropriate to be put forward. He wished his niece parks, carriages, a title, everything that would make this world a pleasant abode, but he wished her not to be cynical, to be, on the contrary, religiously dutiful, and have warm domestic affections. "My dear Gwendolen," he said, rising also and speaking with benignant gravity, "I trust that you will find in marriage a new fountain of duty and affection. Marriage is the only true and satisfactory sphere of a woman, and if your marriage with Mr. Grandcourt should be happily decided upon, you will have, probably, an increasing power, both of rank and wealth, which may be used for the benefit of others. These considerations are something higher than romance. You are fitted by natural gifts for a position which, considering your birth and early prospects, could hardly be looked forward to as in the ordinary course of things, and I trust that you will grace it, not only by those personal gifts, but by a good and consistent life." "I hope mamma will be the happier," said Gwendolen, in a more cheerful way, lifting her hands backward to her neck and moving toward the door. She wanted to waive those higher considerations. Mr. Gascoigne felt that he had come to a satisfactory understanding with his niece, and had furthered her happy settlement in life by furthering her engagement to Grandcourt. Meanwhile there was another person to whom the contemplation of that issue had been a motive for some activity, and who believed that he too on this particular day had done something toward bringing about a favorable decision in his sense, which happened to be the reverse of the rector's. Mr. Lush's absence from Diplow during Gwendolen's visit had been due, not to any fear on his part of meeting that supercilious young lady, or of being abashed by her frank dislike, but to an engagement from which he expected important consequences. He was gone, in fact, to the Wanchester station to meet a lady, accompanied by a maid and 2 children, whom he put into a fly, and afterward followed to the hotel of the Golden Keys in that town. An impressive woman whom many would turn to look at again in passing. Her figure was slim and sufficiently tall, her face rather emaciated so that its sculpturesque beauty was the more pronounced, her crisp hair perfectly black, and her large anxious eyes what we call black. Her dress was soberly correct, her age perhaps physically more advanced than the number of years would imply, but hardly less than 37. An uneasy-looking woman, her glance seemed to presuppose that the people and things were going to be unfavorable to her, while she was nevertheless ready to meet them with resolution. The children were lovely, a dark-haired girl of 6 or more, a fairer boy of 5. When Lush incautiously expressed some surprise at her having brought the children, she said with a sharp-toned intonation, "Did you suppose I should come wandering about here by myself? Why should I not bring all 4 if I liked?" "Oh, certainly," said Lush, with his usual fluent nonchalance. He stayed an hour or so in conference with her, and rode back to Diplow in a state of mind that was at once hopeful and busily anxious as to the execution of the little plan on which his hopefulness was based. Grandcourt's marriage to Gwendolen Harleth would not, he believed, be much of a good to either of them, and it would plainly be fraught with disagreeables to himself. But now he felt confident enough to say inwardly, "I will take, nay, I will lay odds that the marriage will never happen." End of chapter 13. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 14. I will not clothe myself in wreck, wear gems sawed from cramped finger bones of women drowned, feel chilly vaporous hands of ireful ghosts clutching my necklace, trick my maiden breast with orphan's heritage. Let your dead love marry its dead. Gwendolen looked lovely and vigorous as a tall, newly opened lily the next morning. There was a reaction of young energy in her, and yesterday's self-distrust seemed no more than the transient shiver on the surface of a full stream. The roving archery match in Cardell Chase was a delightful prospect for the sport's sake. She felt herself beforehand moving about like a wood nymph under the beeches, in appreciative company, and the imagined scene lent a charm to further advances on the part of Grandcourt. Not an impassioned lyrical daftness for the wood nymph, certainly, but so much the better. To-day Gwendolen foresaw him making slow conversational approaches to a declaration, and foresaw herself awaiting and encouraging it according to the rational conclusion which she had expressed to her uncle. When she came down to breakfast, after every one had left the table except Mrs. Davilow, there were letters on her plate. One of them she read with a gathering smile, and then handed it to her mamma, who on returning it smiled also, finding new cheerfulness in the good spirits her daughter had shown ever since waking, and said, "You don't feel inclined to go 1,000 miles away?" "Not exactly so far." "It was a sad omission not to have written again before this. Can't you write now, before we set out this morning?" "It is not so pressing. To-morrow will do. You see they leave town to-day. I must write to Dover. They will be there till Monday. Shall I write for you, dear, if it pleases you?" Gwendolen did not speak immediately, but after sipping her coffee answered brusquely, "Oh no, let it be. I will write to-morrow." Then feeling a touch of compunction, she looked up and said with playful tenderness, "Dear old beautiful mamma." "Old, child, truly." "Please don't, mamma. I meant old for darling. You are hardly 25 years older than I am. When you talk in that way, my life shrivels up before me." "One can have a great deal of happiness in 25 years, my dear." "I must lose no time in beginning," said Gwendolen merrily. "The sooner I get my palaces and coaches, the better." "And a good husband who adores you, Gwen," said Mrs. Davilow encouragingly. Gwendolen put out her lips saucily and said nothing. It was a slight drawback on her pleasure in starting that the rector was detained by magistrate's business and would probably not be able to get to Cardell Chase at all that day. She cared little that Mrs. Gascoigne and Anna chose not to go without him, but her uncle's presence would have seemed to make it a matter of course that the decision taken would be acted on. For decision in itself began to be formidable. Having come close to accepting Grandcourt, Gwendolen felt this lot of unhoped-for fullness rounding itself too definitely. When we take to wishing a great deal for ourselves, whatever we get soon turns into mere limitation and exclusion. Still there was the reassuring thought that marriage would be the gate into a larger freedom. The place of meeting was a grassy spot called Green Arbor, where a bit of hanging wood made a sheltering amphitheater. It was here that the coachful of servants with provisions had to prepare the picnic meal, and the warden of the chase was to guide the roving archers so as to keep them within the due distance from this center, and hinder them from wandering beyond the limit which had been fixed on, a curve that might be drawn through certain well-known points, such as the double oak, the whispering stones, and the high cross. The plan was to take only a preliminary stroll before luncheon, keeping the main roving expedition for the more exquisite lights of the afternoon. The muster was rapid enough to save every one from dull moments of waiting, and when the groups began to scatter themselves through the light and shadow made here by closely neighboring beeches and there by rarer oaks, one may suppose that a painter would have been glad to look on. This roving archery was far prettier than the stationary game, but success in shooting at variable marks were less favorable by practice, and the hits were distributed among the volunteer archers otherwise than they would have been in target shooting. From this cause, perhaps, as well as from the twofold distraction of being preoccupied and wishing not to betray her preoccupation, Gwendolen did not greatly distinguish herself in these first experiments, unless it were by the lively grace with which she took her comparative failure. She was in white and green as on the day of the former meeting, when it made an epoch for her that she was introduced to Grandcourt. He was continually by her side now, yet it would have been hard to tell from mere looks and manners that their relation to each other had at all changed since their first conversation. Still there were other grounds that made most persons conclude them to be, if not engaged already, on the eve of being so, and she believed this herself. As they were all returning toward Green Arbor in divergent groups, not thinking at all of taking aim, but merely chattering, the words passed which seemed really the beginning of that end, the beginning of her acceptance. Grandcourt said, "Do you know how long it is since I first saw you in this dress?" "The archery meeting was on the 25th, and this is the 13th," said Gwendolen, laughingly. "I am not good at calculating, but I will venture to say that it must be nearly 3 weeks." A little pause, and then he said, "That is a great loss of time." "That your knowing me has caused you? Pray don't be uncomplimentary. I don't like it." Pause again. "It is because of the gain that I feel the loss." Here Gwendolen herself let a pause. She was thinking, "He is really very ingenious. He never speaks stupidly." Her silence was so unusual that it seemed the strongest of favorable answers, and he continued, "The gain of knowing you makes me feel the time I lose in uncertainty. Do you like uncertainty?" "I think I do, rather," said Gwendolen, suddenly beaming on him with a playful smile. "There is more in it." Grandcourt met her laughing eyes with a slow, steady look right into them, which seemed like vision in the abstract, and then said, "Do you mean more torment for me?" There was something so strange to Gwendolen in this moment that she was quite shaken out of her usual self-consciousness. Blushing and turning away her eyes, she said, "No, that would make me sorry." Grandcourt would have followed up this answer, which the change in her manner made apparently decisive of her favorable intention, but he was not in any way overcome so as to be unaware that they were now within sight of everybody, descending the space into Green Arbor, and descending it at an ill-chosen point where it began to be inconveniently steep. This was a reason for offering his hand in the literal sense to help her. She took it, and they came down in silence, much observed by those already on the level, among others by Mrs. Arrowpoint, who happened to be standing with Mrs. Davilow. That lady had now made up her mind that Grandcourt's merits were not such as would have induced Catherine to accept him, Catherine having so high a standard as to have refused Lord Slogan. Hence she looked at the tenant of Diplow with dispassionate eyes. "Mr. Grandcourt is not equal as a man to his uncle, Sir Hugo Mallinger, too languid. To be sure, Mr. Grandcourt is a much younger man, but I shouldn't wonder if Sir Hugo were to outlive him, notwithstanding the difference of years. It is ill calculating on successions," concluded Mrs. Arrowpoint, rather too loudly. "It is indeed," said Mrs. Davilow, able to assent with quiet cheerfulness, for she was so well satisfied with the actual situation of affairs that her habitual melancholy in their general unsatisfactoriness was altogether in abeyance. "I am not concerned to tell of the food that was eaten in that green refectory, or even to dwell on the stories of the forest scenery that spread themselves out beyond the level front of the hollow. being just now bound to tell a story of life at a stage when the blissful beauty of earth and sky entered only by narrow and oblique inlets into the consciousness, which was busy with a small social drama almost as little penetrated by a feeling of wider relations as if it had been a puppet show. It will be understood that the food and champagne were of the best, the talk and laughter too, in the sense of belonging to the best society, where no one makes an invidious display of anything in particular, and the advantages of the world are taken with that high-bred depreciation which follows from being accustomed to them. Some of the gentlemen strolled a little, and indulged in a cigar, there being a sufficient interval before 4 o'clock, the time for beginning to rove again. Among these, strange to say, was Grandcourt, but not Mr. Lush, who seemed to be taking his pleasure quite generously to-day by making himself particularly serviceable, ordering everything for everybody, and by this activity becoming more than ever a blot on the scene to Gwendolen, though he kept himself amiably aloof from her and never even looked at her obviously. When there was a general move to prepare for starting, it appeared that the bows had all been put under the charge of Lord Brackenshaw's valet, and Mr. Lush was concerned to save ladies the trouble of fetching theirs from the carriage where they were propped. He did not intend to bring Gwendolen's, but she, fearful lest he should do so, hurried to fetch it herself. The valet, seeing her approach, met her with it, and in giving it into her hand gave also a letter addressed to her. She asked no question about it, perceived at a glance that the address was in a lady's handwriting, of the delicate kind which used to be esteemed feminine before the present uncial period, and moving away with her bow in her hand, saw Mr. Lush coming to fetch other bows. To avoid meeting him, she turned aside and walked with her back toward the stand of carriages, opening the letter. It contained these words: "If Miss Harleth is in doubt whether she should accept Mr. Grandcourt, let her break from her party after they have passed the Whispering Stones and return to that spot. She will then hear something to decide her, but she can only hear it by keeping this letter a strict secret from every one. If she does not act according to this letter, she will repent, as the woman who writes it has repented. The secrecy Miss Harleth will feel herself bound in honor to guard." Gwendolen felt an inward shock, but her immediate thought was, "It is come in time." It lay in her youthfulness that she was absorbed by the idea of the revelation to be made, and had not even a momentary suspicion of contrivance that could justify her in showing the letter. Her mind gathered itself up at once into the resolution that she would manage to go unobserved to the Whispering Stones, and thrusting the letter into her pocket, she turned back to rejoin the company, with that sense of having something to conceal which to her nature had a bracing quality and helped her to be mistress of herself. It was a surprise to every one that Grandcourt was not, like the other smokers, on the spot in time to set out roving with the rest. "We shall alight on him by and by," said Lord Brackenshaw. "He can't be gone far." At any rate, no man could be waited for. This apparent forgetfulness might be taken for the distraction of a lover so absorbed in thinking of the beloved object as to forget an appointment which would bring him into her actual presence; and the good-natured Earl gave Gwendolen a distant jocose hint to that effect, which she took with suitable quietude. But the thought in her mind was, "Can he too be starting away from a decision?" It was not exactly a pleasant thought to her, but it was near the truth. Starting away, however, was not the right expression for the languor of intention that came over Grandcourt, like a fit of diseased numbness when an end seemed within easy reach. To desist then, when all expectation was to the contrary, became another gratification of mere will, sublimely independent of definite motive. At that moment he had begun a second large cigar in a vague hazy obstinacy, which if Lush or any other mortal who might be insulted with impunity had interrupted by overtaking him with a request for his return, would have expressed itself by a slow removal of his cigar, to say in an undertone, "You'll be kind enough to go to the devil, will you?" But he was not interrupted, and the rovers set off without any visible depression of spirits, leaving behind only a few of the less vigorous ladies, including Mrs. Davilow, who preferred a quiet stroll, free from obligation to keep up with others. The enjoyment of the day was soon at its highest pitch. the archery getting more spirited, and the changing scenes of the forest from roofed grove to open glade growing lovelier with the lengthening shadows, and the deeply felt but undefinable gradations of the mellowing afternoon. It was agreed that they were playing an extemporized As You Like It, and when a pretty compliment had been turned to Gwendolen about her having the part of Rosalind, she felt the more compelled to be surpassing in loveliness. This was not very difficult to her, for the effect of what had happened to-day was an excitement which needed a vent, a sense of adventure rather than alarm, and a straining toward the management of her retreat, so as not to be impeded. The roving had been lasting nearly an hour before the arrival at the Whispering Stones, two tall conical blocks that leaned toward each other like gigantic gray-mantled figures. They were soon surveyed and passed by with the remark that they would be good ghosts on a starlit night. But a soft sunlight was on them now, and Gwendolen felt daring. The stones were near a fine grove of beeches, where the archers found plenty of marks. "How far are we from Green Arbor now?" said Gwendolen, having got in front by the side of the warden. "Oh, not more than half a mile. Taking along the avenue, we're going to cross up there. But I shall take round a couple of miles by the High Cross." She was falling back among the rest, when suddenly they seemed all to be hurrying obliquely forward under the guidance of Mr. Lush, and lingering a little where she was, she perceived her opportunity of slipping away. Soon she was out of sight, and without running she seemed to herself to fly along the ground and count the moments nothing till she found herself back again at the Whispering Stones. They turned their blank gray sides to her. What was there on the other side? If there were nothing after all? That was her only dread now, to have to turn back again in mystification, and walking round the right-hand stone without pause, she found herself in front of someone whose large dark eyes met hers at a foot's distance. In spite of expectation, she was startled and shrank back, but in doing so she could take in the whole figure of this stranger, and perceive that she was unmistakably a lady, and one who must have been exceedingly handsome. She perceived also that a few yards from her were two children seated on the grass. "Miss Harleth," said the lady. "Yes." All Gwendolen's consciousness was wonder. "Have you accepted Mr. Grandcourt?" "No." "I have promised to tell you something, and you will promise to keep my secret. However you may decide, you will not tell Mr. Grandcourt or any one else that you have seen me?" "I promise." "My name is Lydia Glasher. Mr. Grandcourt ought not to marry any one but me. I left my husband and child for him 9 years ago. Those two children are his, and we have 2 others, girls, who are older. My husband is dead now, and Mr. Grandcourt ought to marry me. He ought to make that boy his heir." She looked at the boy as she spoke, and Gwendolen's eyes followed hers. The handsome little fellow was puffing out his cheeks in trying to blow a tiny trumpet which remained dumb. His hat hung backward by a string, and his brown curls caught the sun rays. He was a cherub. The two women's eyes met again, and Gwendolen said proudly, "I will not interfere with your wishes." She looked as if she were shivering, and her lips were pale. "You are very attractive, Miss Harleth, but when he first knew me I too was young. Since then my life has been broken up and embittered. It is not fair that he should be happy and I miserable, and my boy thrust out of sight for another." These words were uttered with a biting accent, but with a determined abstinence from anything violent in tone or manner. Gwendolen, watching Mrs. Glasher's face while she spoke, felt a sort of terror. It was as if some ghastly vision had come to her in a dream and said, "I am a woman's life." "Have you anything more to say to me?" she asked in a low tone, but still proud and coldly. The revulsion within her was not tending to soften her. Every one seemed hateful. "Nothing. You know what I wished you to know. You can inquire about me if you like. My husband was Colonel Glasher." "Then I will go," said Gwendolen, moving away with a ceremonious inclination, which was returned with equal grace. In a few minutes Gwendolen was in the beech grove again, but her party had gone out of sight and apparently had not sent in search of her, for all was solitude till she had reached the avenue pointed out by the warden. She determined to take this way back to Green Arbor, which she reached quickly. rapid movements seeming to her just now a means of suspending the thoughts which might prevent her from behaving with due calm. She had already made up her mind what steps she would take. Mrs. Davilow was of course astonished to see Gwendolen returning alone, and was not without some uneasiness, which the presence of other ladies hindered her from showing. In answer to her words of surprise, Gwendolen said, "Oh, I have been rather silly. I lingered behind to look at the Whispering Stones, and the rest hurried on after something, so I lost sight of them. I thought it best to come home by the short way, the avenue that the warden had told me of. I'm not sorry after all. I had had enough walking." "Your party did not meet Mr. Grandcourt, I presume," said Mrs. Arrowpoint, not without intention. "No," said Gwendolen, with a little flash of defiance and a light laugh. "And we didn't see any carvings on the trees either. Where can he be? I should think he has fallen into the pool or had an apoplectic fit." With all Gwendolen's resolve not to betray any agitation, she could not help it that her tone was unusually high and hard, and her mother felt sure that something unpropitious had happened. Mrs. Arrowpoint thought that the self-confident young lady was much piqued, and that Mr. Grandcourt was probably seeing reason to change his mind. "If you have no objection, mamma, I will order the carriage," said Gwendolen. "I am tired, and every one will be going soon." Mrs. Davilow assented, but by the time the carriage was announced as ready, the horses having to be fetched from the stables on the warden's premises, the roving party reappeared, and with them Mr. Grandcourt. "Ah, there you are," said Lord Brackenshaw, going up to Gwendolen, who was arranging her mamma's shawl for the drive. "We thought at first you had alighted on Grandcourt, and he had taken you home. Lush said so, but after that we met Grandcourt. However, we didn't suppose you could be in any danger. The warden said he had told you a near way back." "You are going," said Grandcourt, coming up with his usual air, as if he did not conceive that there had been any omission on his part. Lord Brackenshaw gave place to him and moved away. "Yes, we are going," said Gwendolen, looking busily at her scarf, which she was arranging across her shoulders Scotch fashion. "May I call at Offendene to-morrow?" "Oh, yes, if you like," said Gwendolen, sweeping him from a distance with her eyelashes. Her voice was light and sharp as the first touch of frost. Mrs. Davilow accepted his arm to lead her to the carriage, but while that was happening, Gwendolen with incredible swiftness had got in advance of them and had sprung into the carriage. "I got in, mamma, because I wished to be on this side," she said, apologetically. But she had avoided Grandcourt's touch. He only lifted his hat and walked away, with the not unsatisfactory impression that she meant to show herself offended by his neglect. The mother and daughter drove for 5 minutes in silence. Then Gwendolen said, "I intend to join the Langens at Dover, mamma. I shall pack up immediately on getting home and set off by the early train. I shall be at Dover almost as soon as they are. We can let them know by telegraph." "Good heavens, child! What can be your reason for saying so?" "My reason for saying it, mamma, is that I mean to do it." "But why do you mean to do it?" "I wish to go away." "Is it because you were offended with Mr. Grandcourt's odd behavior in walking off to-day?" "It is useless to enter into such questions. I am not going in any case to marry Mr. Grandcourt. Don't interest yourself further about it." "What can I say to your uncle, Gwendolen? Consider the position you place me in. You led him to believe only last night that you had made up your mind in favor of Mr. Grandcourt." "I am very sorry to cause you annoyance, mamma dear, but I can't help it," said Gwendolen, with still harder resistance in her tone. "Whatever you or my uncle may think or do, I shall not alter my resolve, and I shall not tell my reason. I don't care what comes of it. I don't care if I never marry any one. There is nothing worth caring for. I believe all men are bad, and I hate them." "But need you set off this way, Gwendolen?" said Mrs. Davilow, miserable and helpless. "Now, mamma, don't interfere with me. If you have ever had any trouble in your own life, remember it, and don't interfere with me. If I am to be miserable, let it be by my own choice." The mother was reduced to trembling silence. She began to see that the difficulty would be lessened if Gwendolen went away. And she did go. The packing was all carefully done that evening, and not long after dawn the next day Mrs. Davilow accompanied her daughter to the railway station. The sweet dews of morning, the cows and horses looking over the hedges without any particular reason, the early travelers on foot with their bundles, seemed all very melancholy and purposeless to them both. The dingy torpor of the railway station, before the ticket could be taken, was still worse. Gwendolen had certainly hardened in the last 24 hours. Her mother's trouble evidently counted for little in her present state of mind, which did not essentially differ from the mood that makes men take to worse conduct when their belief in persons or things is upset. Gwendolen's uncontrolled reading, though consisting chiefly in what are called pictures of life, had somehow not prepared her for this encounter with reality. Is that surprising? It is to be believed that the attendance at the Opera Bouffe in the present day would not leave men's minds entirely without shock if the manners observed there with some applause were suddenly to start up in their own families. Perspective, as its inventor remarked, is a beautiful thing. What horrors of damp huts, where human beings languish, may not become picturesque through aerial distance! What hymning of cancerous vices may we not languish over as sublimest art in the safe remoteness of a strange language and artificial phrase! Yet we keep a repugnance to rheumatism and other painful effects when presented in our personal experience. Mrs. Davilow felt Gwendolen's new phase of indifference keenly, and as she drove back alone, the brightening morning was sadder to her than before. Mr. Grandcourt called that day at Offendene, but nobody was at home. End of chapter 14. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 15. Festina lente. Celerity should be contempered with cunctation. Sir Thomas Browne. Gwendolen, we have seen, passed her time abroad in the new excitement of gambling, and in imagining herself an empress of luck, having brought from her late experience a vague impression that in this confused world it signified nothing what any one did, so that they amused themselves. We have seen too that certain persons, mysteriously symbolized as Grapnell and Company, having also thought of reigning in the realm of luck, and being also bent on amusing themselves, no matter how, had brought about a painful change in her family circumstances, whence she had returned home, carrying with her, against her inclination, a necklace which she had pawned and some one else had redeemed. While she was going back to England, Grandcourt was coming to find her—coming, that is, after his own manner, not in haste by express straight from Diplow to Leubronn, where she was understood to be, but so entirely without hurry that he was induced by the presence of some Russian acquaintances to linger at Baden-Baden and make various appointments with them, which, however, his desire to be at Leubronn ultimately caused him to break. Grandcourt's passions were of the intermittent, flickering kind, never flaming out strongly, but a great deal of life goes on without strong passion. Myriads of cravats are carefully tied, dinners attended, even speeches made proposing the health of august personages without the zest arising from a strong desire, and a man may make a good appearance in high social positions, may be supposed to know the classics, to have his reserves on science, a strong though repressed opinion on politics, and all the sentiments of the English gentleman at a small expense of vital energy. Also he may be obstinate or persistent at the same low rate, and may even show sudden impulses which have a false air of demonic strength, because they seem inexplicable, though perhaps their secret lies merely in the want of regulated channels for the soul to move in, good and sufficient ducts of habit, without which our nature easily turns to mere ooze and mud, and at any pressure yields nothing but a spurt or a puddle. Grandcourt had been altogether displeased by Gwendolen's running away from the splendid chance he was holding out to her. The act had some piquancy for him. He liked to think that it was due to resentment of his careless behavior in Cardell Chase, which, when he came to consider it, did appear rather cool. To have brought her so near a tender admission, and then to have walked headlong away from further opportunities of winning the consent which he had made her understand him to be asking for, was enough to provoke a girl of spirit, and to be worth his mastering it was proper that she should have some spirit. Doubtless she meant him to follow her, and it was what he meant too. But for a whole week he took no measures toward starting, and did not even inquire where Miss Harleth was gone. Mr. Lush felt a triumph that was mingled with much distrust, for Grandcourt had said no word to him about her, and looked as neutral as an alligator. There was no telling what might turn up in the slowly churning chances of his mind. Still, to have put off a decision was to have made room for the waste of Grandcourt's energy. The guests at Diplow felt more curiosity than their host. How was it that nothing more was heard of Miss Harleth? Was it credible that she had refused Mr. Grandcourt? Lady Flora Hollis, a lively middle-aged woman, well endowed with curiosity, felt a sudden interest in making a round of calls with Mrs. Torrington, including the rectory, Offendene, and Quetcham, and thus not only got twice over, but also discussed with the Arrowpoints the information that Miss Harleth was gone to Leubronn, with some old friends, the Baron and Baroness von Langen, for the immediate agitation and disappointment of Mrs. Davilow and the Gascoignes had resolved itself into a wish that Gwendolen's disappearance should not be interpreted as anything eccentric or needful to be kept secret. The rector's mind, indeed, entertained the possibility that the marriage was only a little deferred, for Mrs. Davilow had not dared to tell him of the bitter determination with which Gwendolen had spoken. And in spite of his practical ability, some of his experience had petrified into maxims and quotations. Amarilla's fleeing desired that her hiding-place should be known, and that love will find out the way over the mountain and over the wave may be said without hyperbole in this age of steam. Gwendolen, he conceived, was an Amaryllis of excellent sense, but coquettish daring. The question was whether she had dared too much. Lady Flora, coming back charged with news about Miss Harleth, saw no good reason why she should not try whether she could electrify Mr. Grandcourt by mentioning it to him at the table, and in doing so shot a few hints of a notion having got abroad that he was a disappointed adorer. Grandcourt heard with quietude, but with attention, and the next day he ordered Lush to bring about a decent reason for breaking up the party at Diplow by the end of another week, as he meant to go yachting to the Baltic or somewhere, it being impossible to stay at Diplow as if he were a prisoner on parole with a set of people whom he had never wanted. Lush needed no clearer announcement that Grandcourt was going to Leubronn, but he might go after the manner of a creeping billiard ball and stick on the way. What Mr. Lush intended was to make himself indispensable so that he might go too, and he succeeded, Gwendolen's repulsion for him being a fact that only amused his patron, and made him none the less willing to have Lush always at hand. This was how it happened that Grandcourt arrived at the Czarina on the 5th day after Gwendolen had left Leubronn, and found there his uncle, Sir Hugo Mallinger, with his family, including Deronda. It is not necessarily a pleasure either to the reigning power or the heir presumptive when their separate affairs, a touch of gout, say, in the one, and a touch of willfulness in the other, happen to bring them to the same spot. Sir Hugo was an easy-tempered man, tolerant both of differences and defects, but a point of view different from his own concerning the settlement of the family estates fretted him rather more than if it had concerned church discipline or the ballot, and faults were the less venial for belonging to a person whose existence was inconvenient to him. In no case could Grandcourt have been a nephew after his own heart, but as the presumptive heir to the Mallinger estates, he was the sign and embodiment of a chief grievance in the baronet's life, the want of a son to inherit the lands, in no portion of which had he himself more than a life interest. For in the ill-advised settlement which his father, Sir Francis, had chosen to make by will, even Diplow, with its modicum of land, had been left under the same conditions as the ancient and wide inheritance of the two Toppings. Diplow, where Sir Hugo had lived and hunted through many a season in his younger years, and where his wife and daughters ought to have been able to retire after his death. This grievance had naturally gathered emphasis as the years advanced, and Lady Mallinger, after having had 3 daughters in quick succession, had remained for 8 years till now that she was over 40 without producing so much as another girl; while Sir Hugo, almost 20 years older, was at a time of life when, notwithstanding the fashionable retardation of most things from dinners to marriages, a man's hopefulness is apt to show signs of wear until restored by second childhood. In fact, he had begun to despair of a son, and this confirmation of Grandcourt's interest in the estates certainly tended to make his image and presence the more unwelcome. But on the other hand it carried circumstances which disposed Sir Hugo to take care that the relation between them should be kept as friendly as possible. It led him to dwell on a plan which had grown up side by side with his disappointment of an heir, namely to try and secure Diplow as a future residence for Lady Mallinger and her daughters, and keep this pretty bit of the family inheritance for his own offspring in spite of that disappointment. Such knowledge as he had of his nephew's disposition and affairs encouraged the belief that Grandcourt might consent to a transaction by which he would get a good sum of ready money as an equivalent for his prospective interest in the domain of Diplow and the moderate amount of land attached to it. If, after all, the unhoped-for son should be born, the money would have been thrown away, and Grandcourt would have been paid for giving up interest that had turned out good for nothing. But Sir Hugo set down this risk as nil, and of late years he had husbanded his fortune so well by the working of mines and the sale of leases that he was prepared for an outlay. Here was an object that made him careful to avoid any quarrel with Grandcourt. Some years before, when he was making improvements at the Abbey and needed Grandcourt's concurrence in his felling an obstructive mass of timber on the demesne, he had congratulated himself on finding that there was no active spite against him in his nephew's peculiar mind, and nothing had since occurred to make them hate each other more than was compatible with perfect politeness, or with any accommodation that could be strictly mutual. Grandcourt, on his side, thought his uncle a superfluity and a bore, and felt that the list of things in general would be improved whenever Sir Hugo came to be expunged. But he had been made aware through Lush, always a useful medium, of the baronet's inclinations concerning Diplow, and he was gratified to have the alternative of the money in his mind. Even if he had not thought it in the least likely that he would choose to accept it, his sense of power would have been flattered by his being able to refuse what Sir Hugo desired. The hinted transaction had told for something among the motives which had made him ask for a year's tenancy of Diplow, which it rather annoyed Sir Hugo to grant, because the excellent hunting in the neighborhood might decide Grandcourt not to part with his chance of future possession. A man who has 2 places, in one of which the hunting is less good, naturally desiring a third where it is better. Also Lush had thrown out to Sir Hugo the probability that Grandcourt would woo and win Miss Arrowpoint, and in that case ready money might be less of a temptation to him. Hence, on this unexpected meeting at Leubronn, the baronet felt much curiosity to know how things had been going on at Diplow, was bent on being as civil as possible to his nephew, and looked forward to some private chat with Lush. Between Deronda and Grandcourt there was a more faintly marked but peculiar relation, depending on circumstances which have yet to be made known. But on no side was there any sign of suppressed chagrin on the first meeting at the table d'hôte an hour after Grandcourt's arrival; and when the quartet of gentlemen afterward met on the terrace, without Lady Mallinger, they moved off together to saunter through the rooms, Sir Hugo saying as they entered the large salle, "Did you play much at Baden, Grandcourt?" "No. I looked on and betted a little with some Russians there." "Had you luck?" "What did I win, Lush?" "You brought away about 200," said Lush. "You are not here for the sake of play, then?" said Sir Hugo. "No, I don't care about play now. It's a confounded strain," said Grandcourt, whose diamond ring and demeanor as he moved along playing slightly with his whisker were being a good deal stared at by rouged foreigners interested in a new milord. "The fact is, somebody should invent a mill to do amusements for you, my dear fellow," said Sir Hugo, "as the Tartars get their praying done. But I agree with you. I never cared for play. It's monotonous, knits the brain up into meshes, and it knocks me up to watch it now. I suppose one gets poisoned with the bad air. I never stay here more than 10 minutes. But where's your gambling beauty, Deronda? Have you seen her lately?" "She's gone," said Deronda, curtly. "An uncommonly fine girl, a perfect Diana," said Sir Hugo, turning to Grandcourt again. "Really worth a little straining to look at her. I saw her winning, and she took it as coolly as if she had known it all beforehand. The same day Deronda happened to see her losing like wildfire, and she bore it with immense pluck. I suppose she was cleaned out, or was wise enough to stop in time. How do you know she's gone?" "Oh, by the visitor list," said Deronda, with a scarcely perceptible shrug. "Vandernoodt told me her name was Harleth, and she was with the Baron and Baroness von Langen. I saw by the list that Miss Harleth was no longer there." This held no further information for Lush than that Gwendolen had been gambling. He had already looked at the list and ascertained that Gwendolen had gone, but he had no intention of thrusting this knowledge on Grandcourt before he asked for it, and he had not asked, finding it enough to believe that the object of search would turn up somewhere or other. But now Grandcourt had heard what was rather piquant, and not a word about Miss Harleth had been missed by him. After a moment's pause he said to Deronda, "Do you know those people—the Langens?" "I have talked with them a little since Miss Harleth went away. I knew nothing of them before." "Where is she gone, do you know?" "She has gone home," said Deronda, coldly, as if he wished to say no more. But then, from a fresh impulse, he turned to look markedly at Grandcourt, and added, "But it is possible you know her. Her home is not far from Diplow—Offendene, near Wanchester." Deronda, turning to look straight at Grandcourt, who was on his left hand, might have been a subject for those old painters who liked contrasts of temperament. There was a calm intensity of life and richness of tint in his face that on a sudden gaze from him was rather startling, and often made him seem to have spoken, so that servants and officials asked him automatically, "What did you say, sir?" when he had been quite silent. Grandcourt himself felt an irritation, which he did not show except by a slight movement of the eyelids at Deronda's turning round on him when he was not asked to do more than speak. But he answered, with his usual drawl, "Yes, I know her," and paused with his shoulder toward Deronda to look at the gambling. "What of her, eh?" asked Sir Hugo of Lush, as the three moved on a little way. "She must be a newcomer at Offendene. Old Blenny lived there after the dowager died." "A little too much of her," said Lush, in a low, significant tone, not sorry to let Sir Hugo know the state of affairs. "Why, how?" said the baronet. They all moved out of the salon into an airy promenade. "He has been on the brink of marrying her," Lush went on, "but I hope it's off now. She's a niece of the clergyman, Gascoigne, at Pennicote. Her mother is a widow with a brood of daughters. This girl will have nothing, and is as dangerous as gunpowder. It would be a foolish marriage, but she has taken a freak against him, for she ran off here without notice, when he had agreed to call the next day. The fact is, he's here after her, but he was in no great hurry, and between his caprice and hers they are likely enough not to get together again. But of course he has lost his chance with the heiress." Grandcourt, joining them, said, "What a beastly den this is! A worse hole than Baden. I shall go back to the hotel." When Sir Hugo and Deronda were alone, the baronet began, "Rather a pretty story. That girl has something in her. She must be worth running after. Has de l'imprévu. I think her appearance on the scene has bettered my chance of getting Diplow, whether the marriage comes off or not." "I should hope a marriage like that would not come off," said Deronda, in a tone of disgust. "What, are you a little touched with the sublime, Lash?" said Sir Hugo, putting up his glasses to help his short sight and looking at his companion. "Are you inclined to run after her?" "On the contrary," said Deronda, "I should rather be inclined to run away from her." "Why, you would easily cut out Grandcourt. A girl with her spirit would think you the finer match of the two," said Sir Hugo, who often tried Deronda's patience by finding a joke in impossible advice. A difference of taste in jokes is a great strain on the affections. "I suppose pedigree and land belong to a fine match," said Deronda, coldly. "The best horse will win in spite of pedigree, my boy. You remember Napoleon's 'Moi, je suis un ancêtre. said Sir Hugo, who habitually undervalued birth, as men, after dining well, often agree that the good of life is distributed with wonderful equality. "I am not sure that I want to be an ancestor," said Deronda. "It doesn't seem to me the rarest sort of origination." "You won't run after the pretty gambler, then?" said Sir Hugo, putting down his glasses. "Decidedly not." This answer was perfectly truthful. Nevertheless, it had passed through Deronda's mind that under other circumstances he should have given way to the interest this girl had raised in him, and tried to know more of her. But his history had given him a stronger bias in another direction. He felt himself in no sense free. End of chapter 15. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 16. Men, like planets, have both a visible and an invisible history. The astronomer threads the darkness with strict deduction, accounting so for every visible arc in the wanderer's orbit; and the narrator of human actions, if he did his work with the same completeness, would have to thread the hidden pathways of feeling and thought which lead up to every moment of action, and to those moments of intense suffering which take the quality of action, like the cry of Prometheus, whose chained anguish seems a greater energy than the sea and sky he invokes and the deity he defies. Deronda's circumstances indeed had been exceptional. One moment had been burned into his life as its chief epoch, a moment full of July sunshine and large pink roses shedding their last petals on a grassy court enclosed on three sides by a Gothic cloister. Imagine him in such a scene, a boy of 13, stretched prone on the grass where it was in shadow, his curly head propped on his arms over a book, while his tutor, also reading, sat on a camp-stool under shelter. Deronda's book was Sismondi's History of the Italian Republics. The lad had a passion for history, eager to know how time had been filled up since the flood, and how things were carried on in the dull periods. Suddenly he let down his left arm and looked at his tutor, saying in purest boyish tones, "Mr. Fraser, how was it that the popes and cardinals always had so many nephews?" The tutor, an able young Scotchman who acted as Sir Hugo Mallinger's secretary, roused rather unwillingly from his political economy, answered with the clear-cut emphatic chant which makes a truth doubly telling in Scotch utterance, "Their own children were called nephews." "Why?" said Deronda. "It was just for the propriety of the thing, because, as you know very well, priests don't marry, and the children were illegitimate." Mr. Fraser, thrusting out his lower lip and making his chant of the last word the more emphatic for a little impatience at being interrupted, had already turned his eyes on his book again, while Deronda, as if something had stung him, started up in a sitting attitude with his back to the tutor. He had always called Sir Hugo Mallinger his uncle, and when it once occurred to him to ask about his father and mother, the baronet had answered, "You lost your father and mother when you were quite a little one. That is why I take care of you." Daniel, then straining to discern something in that early twilight, had a dim sense of having been kissed very much and surrounded by thin, cloudy, scented drapery, till his fingers caught in something hard which hurt him and he began to cry. Every other memory he had was of the little world in which he still lived. And at that time he did not mind about learning more, for he was too fond of Sir Hugo to be sorry for the loss of unknown parents. Life was very delightful to the lad, with an uncle who was always indulgent and cheerful, a fine man in the bright noon of life, whom Daniel thought absolutely perfect, and whose place was one of the finest in England, at once historical, romantic, and homelike, a picturesque architectural outgrowth from an abbey which had still remnants of the old monastic trunk. Diplow lay in another county, and was a comparatively landless place which had come into the family from a rich lawyer on the female side, who wore the peruke of the Restoration. whereas Mallingers had the grant of Monk's Topping under Henry VIII., and ages before had held the neighboring lands of King's Topping, tracing indeed their origin to a certain Hugh le Malingre who came in with the Conqueror, and also apparently with a sickly complexion which had been happily corrected in his descendants. Two rows of these descendants, direct and collateral, females of the male line and males of the female, looked down in the gallery over the cloisters on the nephew Daniel as he walked there. Men in armor with pointed beards and arched eyebrows, pinched ladies in hoops and ruffs with no face to speak of, grave-looking men in black velvet and stuffed hips, and fair frightened women holding little boys by the hand, smiling politicians in magnificent perukes, and ladies of the prize-animal kind, with rosebud mouths and full eyelids, according to Lely, then a generation whose faces were revised and embellished in the taste of Kneller, and so on through refined editions of the family types in the time of Reynolds and Romney, till the line ended with Sir Hugo and his younger brother Henley. This last had married Miss Grandcourt and taken her name along with her estates, thus making a junction between two equally old families, impaling the three Saracens' heads proper and three bezants of the one, with the Tower and Falcons Argent of the other, and as it happened, uniting their highest advantages in the prospects of that Henley Mallinger Grandcourt who is at present more of an acquaintance to us than either Sir Hugo or his nephew Daniel Deronda. In Sir Hugo's youthful portrait with rolled collar and high cravat, Sir Thomas Lawrence had done justice to the agreeable alacrity of expression and sanguine temperament still to be seen in the original, but had done something more than justice in slightly lengthening the nose, which was in reality shorter than might have been expected in a Mallinger. Happily the appropriate nose of the family reappeared in his younger brother, and was to be seen in all its refined regularity in his nephew Mallinger Grandcourt. But in the nephew Daniel Deronda the family faces of various types, seen on the walls of the gallery, found no reflex. Still he was handsomer than any of them, and when he was 13 might have served as model for any painter who wanted to image the most memorable of boys. You could hardly have seen his face thoroughly meeting yours without believing that human creatures had done nobly in times past, and might do more nobly in time to come. The finest childlike faces have this consecrating power, and make us shudder anew at all the grossness and basely wrought griefs of the world, lest they should enter here and defile. But at this moment on the grass among the rose petals, Daniel Deronda was making a first acquaintance with those griefs. A new idea had entered his mind and was beginning to change the aspect of his habitual feelings, as happy careless voyagers are changed with the sky suddenly threatened and the thought of danger arises. He sat perfectly still with his back to the tutor, while his face expressed rapid inward transition. The deep blush, which had come when he first started up, gradually subsided, but his features kept that indescribable look of subdued activity which often accompanies a new mental survey of familiar facts. He had not lived with other boys, and his mind showed the same blending of child's ignorance with surprising knowledge which is oftener seen in bright girls. Having read Shakespeare as well as a great deal of history, he could have talked with the wisdom of a bookish child about men who were born out of wedlock and were held unfortunate in consequence, being under disadvantages which required them to be a sort of heroes if they were to work themselves up to an equal standing with their legally born brothers. But he had never brought such knowledge into any association with his own lot, which had been too easy for him ever to think about it, until this moment, when there had darted into his mind with the magic of quick comparison the possibility that here was the secret of his own birth, and that the man whom he called uncle was really his father. Some children, even younger than Daniel, have known the first arrival of care like an ominous, irremovable guest in their tender lives, on the discovery that their parents, whom they had imagined able to buy everything, were poor and in hard money troubles. Daniel felt the presence of a new guest who seemed to come with an enigmatic veiled face, and to carry dimly conjectured, dreaded revelations. The ardor which he had given to the imaginary world in his books suddenly rushed toward his own history and spent its pictorial energy there, explaining what he knew, representing the unknown. The uncle whom he loved very dearly took the aspect of a father who held secrets about him, who had done him a wrong—yes, a wrong. And what had become of his mother, for whom he must have been taken away? Secrets about which he, Daniel, could never inquire. For to speak or to be spoken to about these new thoughts seemed like falling flakes of fire to his imagination. Those who have known an impassioned childhood will understand this dread of utterance about any shame connected with their parents. The impetuous advent of new images took possession of him with the force of fact for the first time told, and left him no immediate power for the reflection that he might be trembling at a fiction of his own. The terrible sense of collision between a strong rush of feeling and the dread of its betrayal found relief at length in big slow tears, which fell without restraint until the voice of Mr. Fraser was heard saying, "Daniel, do you see that you are sitting on the bent pages of your book?" Daniel immediately moved the book without turning round, and after holding it before him for an instant, rose with it and walked away into the open grounds, where he could dry his tears unobserved. The first shock of suggestion past, he could remember that he had no certainty how things really had been, and that he had been making conjectures about his own history, as he had often made stories about Pericles or Columbus, just to fill up the blanks before they became famous. Only there came back certain facts which had an obstinate reality, almost like the fragments of a bridge telling you unmistakably how the arches lay. And again there came a mood in which his conjectures seemed like a doubt of religion, to be banished as an offense and a mean prying after what he was not meant to know. For there was hardly a delicacy of feeling this lad was not capable of. But the summing up of all his fluctuating experience at this epoch was, that a secret impression had come to him which had given him something like a new sense in relation to all the elements of his life. And the idea that others probably knew things concerning which they did not choose to mention, set up in him a premature reserve which helped to intensify his inward experience. His ears opened now to words which before that July day would have passed by him unnoted, and round every trivial incident which imagination could connect with his suspicions, a newly roused set of feelings were ready to cluster themselves. One such incident a month later wrought itself deeply into his life. Daniel had not only one of those thrilling boy voices which seem to bring an idyllic heaven and earth before our eyes, but a fine musical instinct, and had early made out accompaniments for himself on the piano, while he sang from memory. Since then he had had some teaching, and Sir Hugo, who delighted in the boy, used to ask for his music in the presence of guests. One morning, after he had been singing "Sweet Echo" before a small party of gentlemen whom the rain had kept in the house, the baronet, passing from a smiling remark to his next neighbor, said, "Come here, Dan." The boy came forward with unusual reluctance. He wore an embroidered holland blouse which set off the rich coloring of his head and throat, and the resistant gravity about his mouth and eyes as he was being smiled upon made their beauty the more impressive. Every one was admiring him. "What do you say to being a great singer? Should you like to be adored by the world and take the house by storm, like Mario and Tamberlik?" Daniel reddened instantaneously, but there was just perceptible interval before he answered with angry decision, "No, I should hate it." "Well, well, well," said Sir Hugo, with surprised kindliness intended to be soothing. But Daniel turned away quickly, left the room, and going to his own chamber threw himself on the broad window-sill, which was a favorite retreat of his when he had nothing particular to do. Here he could see the rain gradually subsiding with gleams through the parting clouds, which lit up a great reach of the park, where the old oaks stood apart from each other, and the bordering wood was pierced with a green glade which met the eastern sky. This was a scene which had always been part of his home, part of the dignified ease which had been a matter of course in his life, and his ardent clinging nature had appropriated it all with affection. He knew a great deal of what it was to be a gentleman by inheritance, and without thinking much about himself, for he was a boy of active perceptions and easily forgot his own existence in that of Robert Bruce, he had never supposed that he could be shut out from such a lot, or have a very different part in the world from that of the uncle who petted him. It is possible, though not greatly believed in at present, to be fond of poverty and take it for a bride, to prefer scoured deal, red quarries, and whitewash for one's private surroundings, to delight in no splendor but what has opened doors for the whole nation, and to glory in having no privileges except such as nature insists on. And noblemen have been known to run away from the elaborate ease and the option of idleness, that they might bind themselves for small pay to hard-handed labor. But Daniel's tastes were altogether in keeping with his nurture. His disposition was one in which everyday scenes and habits beget not ennui, nor rebellion, but delight, affection, aptitudes. And now the lad had been stung to the quick by the idea that his uncle, perhaps his father, thought of a career for him which was totally unlike his own, and which he knew very well was not thought of among possible destinations for the sons of English gentlemen. He had often stayed in London with Sir Hugo, who, to indulge the boy's ear, had carried him to the opera to hear the great tenors, so that the image of a singer taking the house by storm was very vivid to him. But now, spite of his musical gift, he set himself bitterly against the notion of being dressed up to sing before all those fine people, who would not care about him except as a wonderful toy. That Sir Hugo should have a thought of him in that position for a moment seemed to Daniel an unmistakable proof that there was something about his birth which threw him out from the class of gentlemen to which the baronet belonged. Would it ever be mentioned to him? Would the time come when his uncle would tell him everything? He shrank from the prospect. In his imagination he preferred ignorance. If his father had been wicked, Daniel inwardly used strong words, for he was feeling the injury done him as a maimed boy feels the crushed limb for which others is merely reckoned in an average of accidents. If his father had done any wrong, he wished it might never be spoken of to him. It was already a cutting thought that such knowledge might be in other minds. Was it in Mr. Fraser's? Probably not, else he would not have spoken in that way about the Pope's nephews. Daniel fancied, as older people do, that every one else's consciousness was as active as his own on a matter which was vital to him. Did Turvey the valet know? Did old Mrs. French the housekeeper? And Banks the bailiff, with whom he had ridden about the farms on his pony? And now there came back the recollection of a day some years before when he was drinking Mrs. Banks's whey, and Banks said to his wife with a wink and a cunning laugh, "He features the mother, eh?" At that time little Daniel had merely thought that Banks made a silly face, as the common farming men often did, laughing at what was not laughable; and he rather resented being winked at and talked of as if he did not understand everything. But now that small incident became information. It was to be reasoned on. How could he be like his mother and not like his father? His mother must have been a Mallinger, if Sir Hugo were his uncle. But no! His father might have been Sir Hugo's brother and have changed his name, as Mr. Henleigh Mallinger did when he married Miss Grandcourt. But then why had he never heard Sir Hugo speak of his brother Deronda, as he spoke of his brother Grandcourt? Daniel never before cared about the family tree, only about that ancestor who had killed 3 Saracens in one encounter. But now his mind turned to a cabinet of estate maps in the library, where he had once seen an illuminated parchment hanging out, that Sir Hugo said was the family tree. The phrase was new and odd to him. He was a little fellow then, hardly more than half his present age, and he gave it no precise meaning. He knew more now, and wished that he could examine that parchment. He imagined that the cabinet was always locked, and longed to try it. But here he checked himself. He might be seen, and he would never bring himself near even a silent admission of the sore that had opened in him. It is in such experiences of a boy or girlhood, while elders are debating whether most education lies in science or literature, that the main lines of character are often laid down. If Daniel had been of a less ardently affectionate nature, the reserve about himself and the supposition that others had something to his disadvantage in their minds might have turned into a hard, proud antagonism. But inborn lovingness was strong enough to keep itself level with resentment. There was hardly any creature in his habitual world that he was not fond of. teasing them occasionally, of course, all except his uncle, or nunc, as Sir Hugo had taught him to say, for the baronet was the reverse of a straight-laced man, and left his dignity to take care of itself. Him Daniel loved in that deep-rooted filial way which makes children always the happier for being in the same room with father or mother, though their occupations may be quite apart. Sir Hugo's watch-chain and seals, his handwriting, his mode of smoking and of talking to his dogs and horses, had all a rightness and charm about them to the boy which went along with the happiness of morning and breakfast-time. That Sir Hugo had always been a Whig, made Tories and Radicals equally opponents of the truest and best, and the books he had written were all seen under the same consecration of loving belief, which differenced what was his from what was not his, in spite of general resemblance. Those writings were various, from volumes of travel in the brilliant style to articles on things in general, and pamphlets on political crises. But to Daniel they were alike in having an unquestionable rightness by which other people's information could be tested. Who cannot imagine the bitterness of a first suspicion that something in this object of complete love was not quite right? Children demand that their heroes should be fleckless, and easily believe them so. Perhaps a first discovery to the contrary is hardly a less revolutionary shock to a passionate child than the threatened downfall of habitual beliefs which makes the world seem to totter for us in maturer life. But some time after this renewal of Daniel's agitation, it appeared that Sir Hugo must have been making a merely playful experiment in his question about the singing. He sent for Daniel into the library, and looking up from his writing as the boy entered, threw himself sideways in his arm-chair. "Ah, Dan," he said kindly, drawing one of the old embroidered stools close to him, "come and sit down here." Daniel obeyed, and Sir Hugo put a gentle hand on his shoulder, looking at him affectionately. "What is it, my boy? Have you heard anything that has put you out of spirits lately?" Daniel was determined not to let the tears come, but he could not speak. "All changes are painful when people have been happy, you know," said Sir Hugo, lifting his hand from the boy's shoulder to his dark curls and rubbing them gently. "You can't be educated exactly as I wish you to be without our parting, and I think you will find a great deal to like at school." This was not what Daniel expected, and was so far a relief which gave him spirit to answer, "Am I to go to school?" "Yes, I mean you to go to Eton. I wish you to have the education of an English gentleman, and for that it is necessary that you should go to a public school in preparation for the university. Cambridge I mean you to go to. It was my own university." Daniel's color came and went. "What do you say, Sirrah?" said Sir Hugo, smiling. "I should like to be a gentleman," said Daniel, with firm distinctness, "and go to school, if that is what a gentleman's son must do." Sir Hugo watched him silently for a few moments, thinking he understood now why the lad had seemed angry at the notion of becoming a singer. Then he said tenderly, "And so you won't mind about leaving your old nunc?" "Yes, I shall," said Daniel, clasping Sir Hugo's caressing arm with both his hands. "But shan't I come home and be with you on the holidays?" "Oh yes, generally," said Sir Hugo. "But now I mean you to go at once to a new tutor, to break the change for you before you go to Eton." After this interview Daniel's spirit rose again. He was meant to be a gentleman, and in some unaccountable way it might be that his conjectures were all wrong. The very keenness of the lad taught him to find comfort in his ignorance. While he was busying his mind in the construction of possibilities, it became plain to him that there must be possibilities of which he knew nothing. He left off brooding, young joy and the spirit of adventure not being easily quenched within him, and in the interval before his going away he sang about the house, danced among the old servants, making them parting gifts, and insisted many times to the groom on the care that was to be taken of the black pony. "Do you think I shall know much less than the other boys, Mr. Fraser?" said Daniel. It was his bent to think that every stranger would be surprised at his ignorance. "There are dunces to be found everywhere," said the judicious Fraser. "You'll not be the biggest, but you've not the makings of a Porson in you, or a Leibnitz either." "I don't want to be a Porson or a Leibnitz," said Daniel. "I would rather be a great leader like Pericles or Washington." "Aye, aye, you've a notion they did with little parsing and less algebra," said Fraser. But in reality he thought his pupil a remarkable lad, to whom one thing was as easy as another, if he only had a mind to it. Things went on very well with Daniel in his new world, except that a boy with whom he was at once inclined to strike up a close friendship talked to him a great deal about his home and parents, and seemed to expect a like expansiveness in return. Daniel immediately shrank into reserve, and this experience remained a check on his naturally strong bent toward the formation of intimate friendship. Every one, his tutor included, set him down as a reserved boy, though he was so good-humored and unassuming, as well as quick both at study and sport, that nobody called his reserve disagreeable. Certainly his face had a great deal to do with that favorable interpretation, but in this instance the beauty of the closed lips told no falsehood. A surprise that came to him before his first vacation strengthened the silent consciousness of a grief within, which might be compared in some ways with Byron's susceptibility about his deformed foot. Sir Hugo wrote word that he was married to Miss Raymond, a sweet lady whom Daniel must remember having seen. The event would make no difference about his spending the vacation at the Abbey. He would find Lady Mallinger a new friend whom he would be sure to love, and much more to the usual effect when a man, having done something agreeable to himself, is disposed to congratulate others on his own good fortune, and the deducible satisfactoriness of events in general. Let Sir Hugo be partly excused until the grounds of his action can be more fully known. The mistakes in his behavior to Deronda were due to that dullness toward what may be going on in other minds, especially the minds of children, which is among the commonest deficiencies even in good-natured men like him, when life has been generally easy to themselves, and their energies have been quietly spent in feeling gratified. No one was better aware than he that Daniel was generally suspected to be his own son, but he was pleased with that suspicion, and his imagination had never once been troubled with the way in which the boy himself might be affected, either then or in the future, by the enigmatic aspect of his circumstances. He was as fond of him as could be, and meant the best by him; and, considering the lightness with which the preparation of young lives seemed to lie on respectable consciences, Sir Hugo Mallinger can hardly be held open to exceptional reproach. He had been a bachelor till he was 45, had always been regarded as a fascinating man of elegant tastes. What could be more natural, even according to the index of language, than that he should have a beautiful boy like the little Deronda to take care of? The mother might even, perhaps, be in the great world, met with in Sir Hugo's residence abroad. The only person to feel any objection was the boy himself, who could not have been consulted, and the boy's objections had never been dreamed of by anybody but himself. By the time Deronda was ready to go to Cambridge, Lady Mallinger had already 3 daughters, charming babies, all 3, but whose sex was announced as a melancholy alternative, the offspring desired being a son. If Sir Hugo had no son, the succession must go to his nephew Mallinger Grandcourt. Daniel no longer held a wavering opinion about his own birth. His fuller knowledge had tended to convince him that Sir Hugo was his father, and he conceived that the baronet, since he never approached a communication on the subject, wished him to have a tacit understanding of the fact, and to accept in silence what would be generally considered more than the due love and nurture. Sir Hugo's marriage might certainly have been felt as a new ground of resentment by some youths in Deronda's position, and the timid Lady Mallinger with her fast-coming little ones might have been images to scowl at, as likely to divert much that was disposable in the feelings and possessions of the baronet from one who felt his own claim to be prior. But hatred of innocent human obstacles was a form of moral stupidity not in Deronda's grain. Even the indignation which had long mingled itself with his affection for Sir Hugo took the quality of pain rather than of temper, and as his mind ripened to the idea of tolerance toward error, he habitually liked the idea with his own silent grievances. The sense of an entailed disadvantage, the deformed foot doubtfully hidden by the shoe, makes a restlessly active spiritual yeast, and easily turns a self-centered, unloving nature into an Ishmaelite. But in the rarer sort, who presently see their own frustrated claim as one among a myriad, The inexorable sorrows takes the form of fellowship and makes the imagination tender. Deronda's early weakened susceptibility, charged at first with ready indignation and resistant pride, had raised in him a premature reflection on certain questions of life. It had given a bias to his conscience, a sympathy with certain ills, and a tension of resolve in certain directions, who marked him off from other youths much more than any talents he possessed. One day near the end of the long vacation, when he had been making a tour in the Rhineland with his Eton tutor, and was come for a farewell stay at the Abbey before going to Cambridge, he said to Sir Hugo, "What do you intend me to be, sir?" They were in the library, and it was the fresh morning. Sir Hugo had called him in to read a letter from a Cambridge don who was to be interested in him; and since the baronet wore an air at once business-like and leisurely, the moment seemed propitious for entering on a grave subject which had never yet been thoroughly discussed. "Whatever your inclination leads you to, my boy. I thought it right to give you the option of the army, but you shut the door on that, and I was glad. I don't expect you to choose just yet. By and by, when you have looked about you a little more and tried your mettle among older men. The university has a good wide opening into the forum. There are prizes to be won, and a bit of good fortune often gives the turn to a man's taste. From what I see and hear, I should think you can take up anything you like. You are in the deeper water with your classics than I ever got into, and if you are rather sick of that swimming, Cambridge is the place where you can go into mathematics with a will, and disport yourself on the dry sand as much as you like. I floundered along like a carp." "I suppose money will make some difference, sir," said Daniel, blushing. "I shall have to keep myself by and by." "Not exactly. I recommend you not to be extravagant. Yes, yes, I know you are not inclined to that. But you need not take up anything against the grain. You will have a bachelor's income, enough for you to look about with. Perhaps I had better tell you that you may consider yourself secure of 700 a year. You might make yourself a barrister, be a writer, take up politics. I confess that is what would please me best. I should like to have you at my elbow and pulling with me." Deronda looked embarrassed. He felt that he ought to make some sign of gratitude, but other feelings clogged his tongue. A moment was passing by in which a question about his birth was throbbing within him, and yet it seemed more impossible than ever that the question should find vent, more impossible than ever that he could hear certain things from Sir Hugo's lips. The liberal way in which he was dealt with was the more striking because the baronet had of late cared particularly for money, and for making the utmost of his life interest in the estate by way of providing for his daughters; and as all this flashed through Daniel's mind, it was momentarily within his imagination that the provision for him might come in some way from his mother. But such vaporous conjecture passed away as quickly as it came. Sir Hugo appeared not to notice anything peculiar in Daniel's manner, and presently went on with his usual chatty liveliness. "I am glad you have done some good reading outside your classics, and have got a grip on French and German. The truth is, unless a man can get the prestige and income of a don and write donnish books, it's hardly worth while for him to make a Greek and Latin machine of himself, and be able to spin you out pages of the Greek dramatists at any verse you'll give him as a cue. That's all very fine, but in practical life nobody does give you the cue for pages of Greek. In fact, it's a nicety of conversation which I would have you attend to. Much quotation of any sort, even in English, is bad. It tends to choke ordinary remark. One couldn't carry on life comfortably without a little blindness to the fact that everything had been said better than we can put it ourselves. But talking of dons, I have seen dons make a capital figure in society, and occasionally he can shoot you down a cartload of learning in the right place, which will tell in politics. Such men are wanted, and if you have any turn for being a don, I say nothing against it." "I think there's not much chance of that. Quicksett and Puller are both stronger than I am. I hope you will not be much disappointed if I don't come out with high honors." "No, no, I should like you to do yourself credit, but for God's sake don't come out as a superior expensive kind of idiot like young Brecon, who got a double first and has been learning to knit braces ever since. What I wish you to get is a passport in life. I don't go against our university system. We want a little disinterested culture to make head against cotton and capital, especially in the House. My Greek has all evaporated, but if I had to construe a verse on a sudden, I should get an apoplectic fit. But it formed my taste. I dare say my English is the better for it." On this point Daniel kept a respectful silence. The enthusiastic belief in Sir Hugo's writings as a standard and in the Whigs as the chosen race among politicians had gradually vanished along with the seraphic boy's face. He had not been the hardest of workers at Eton. Although some kinds of study and reading came as easily as boating to him, he was not of the material that usually makes the first-rate Eton scholar. There had sprung in him a meditative yearning after wide knowledge which is likely always to abate ardor in the fight for prize acquirement in narrow tracks. Happily he was modest, and took any second-rateness in himself simply as a fact, not as a marvel necessarily to be accounted for by a superiority. Still Mr. Fraser's high opinion of the lad had not been altogether belied by the youth. Daniel had the stamp of rarity in a subdued fervor of sympathy, an activity of imagination on behalf of others which did not show itself effusively, but was continually seen in acts of considerateness that struck his companions as moral eccentricity. "Deronda would have been first-rate if he had had more ambition," was a frequent remark about him. But how could a fellow push his way properly when he objected to swap for his own advantage, knocked under by choice when he was within an inch of victory, and, unlike the great Clive, would rather be the calf than the butcher? It was a mistake, however, to suppose that Deronda had not his share of ambition. We know he had suffered keenly from the belief that there was a tinge of dishonor in his lot, but there are some cases, and he was one of them, in which the sense of injury breeds, not the will to inflict injuries and climb over them as a ladder, but a hatred of all injury. He had his flashes of fierceness and could hit out upon occasion, but the occasions were not always what might have been expected; for in what related to himself his resentful impulses had been early checked by a mastering affectionateness. Love has a habit of saying "never mind" to angry self, who, sitting down for the nonce in the lower place, by and by gets used to it. So it was that as Deronda approached manhood his feeling for Sir Hugo, while it was getting more and more mixed with criticism, was gaining in that sort of allowance which reconciles criticism with tenderness. The dear old beautiful home and everything within it, Lady Mallinger and her little ones included, were consecrated for the youth as they had been for the boy, only with a certain difference of light on the objects. The altar-piece was no longer miraculously perfect, painted under infallible guidance, but the human hand discerned in the work was appealing to a reverent tenderness safer from the gusts of discovery. Certainly Deronda's ambition, even in his springtime, lay exceptionally aloof from conspicuous vulgar triumph and from other ugly forms of boyish energy. Perhaps he was early impassioned by ideas and burned his fire on those heights. One may spend a good deal of energy in disliking and resisting what others pursue, and a boy who is fond of somebody else's pencil case may not be more energetic than another who is fond of giving his own pencil case away. Still it was not Deronda's disposition to escape from ugly scenes. He was more inclined to sit through them and take care of the fellow least able to take care of himself. It had helped to make him popular that he was sometimes a little compromised by this apparent comradeship; for a meditative interest in learning how human miseries are wrought, as precocious in him as another sort of genius in the poet who writes a Queen Mab at 19, was so infused with kindliness that it easily passed for comradeship. Enough. In many of our neighbors' lives there is much not only of error and lapse, but of a certain exquisite goodness which can never be written or even spoken, only divined by each of us according to the inward instruction of our own privacy. The impression he made at Cambridge corresponded to his position at Eton. Every one interested in him agreed that he might have taken a high place if his motives had been of a more pushing sort, and if he had not, instead of regarding studies as instruments of success, hampered himself with the notion that they were to feed motive and opinion, a notion which set him criticizing methods and arguing against his freight and harness when he should have been using all his might to pull. In the beginning his work at the university had a new zest for him. Indifferent to the continuation of Eton classical drill, he applied himself vigorously to mathematics, for which he had shown an early aptitude under Mr. Fraser, and he had the delight of feeling his strength in a comparatively fresh exercise of thought. That delight and the favorable opinion of his tutor determined him to try for a mathematical scholarship in the Easter of his second year. He wished to gratify Sir Hugo by some achievement, and the study of the higher mathematics, having the growing fascination inherent in all thinking which demands intensity, was making him a more exclusive worker than he had been before. But here came the old check which had been growing with his growth. He found the inward bent toward comprehension and thoroughness diverging more and more from the track marked out by the standards of examination. He felt a heightening discontent with the wearing futility and enfeebling strain of a demand for excessive retention and dexterity without any insight into the principles which form the vital connections of knowledge. Deronda's undergraduateship occurred 15 years ago, when the perfection of our university methods was not yet indisputable. In hours when his dissatisfaction was strong upon him, he reproached himself for having been attracted by the conventional advantage of belonging to an English university, and was tempted toward the project of asking Sir Hugo to let him quit Cambridge and pursue a more independent line of study abroad. The germs of this inclination had been already stirring in his boyish love of universal history, which made him want to be at home in foreign countries and follow in imagination the traveling students of the Middle Ages. He longed now to have the sort of apprenticeship to life which would not shape him too definitely and rob him of the choice that might come from a free growth. One sees that Deronda's demerits were likely to be on the side of reflective hesitation, and this tendency was encouraged by his position. There was no need for him to get an immediate income, or to fit himself in haste for a profession, and his sensibility to the half-known facts of his parentage made him an excuse for lingering longer than others in a state of social neutrality. Other men, he inwardly said, had a more definite place and duties, but the project which flattered his inclination might not have gone beyond the stage of ineffective brooding if certain circumstances had not quickened it into action. The circumstances arose out of an enthusiastic friendship which extended into his after-life. On the same year with himself, and occupying small rooms close to his, was a youth who had come as an exhibitioner from Christ's Hospital, and had eccentricities enough for a Charles Lamb. Only to look at his pinched features and blonde hair hanging over his collar reminded one of pale quaint heads by early German painters. And when this faint coloring was lit up by a joke, there came such sudden creases about the mouth and eyes which might have been molded by the soul of an aged humorist. His father, an engraver of some distinction, had been dead 11 years, and his mother had 3 girls to educate and maintain on a meager annuity. Hans Meyrick, he had been daringly christened after Holbein, felt himself the pillar, or rather the knotted and twisted trunk round which these feeble climbing plants must cling. There was no want of ability or of honest well-meaning affection to make the prop trustworthy. The ease and quickness with which he studied might serve him to win prizes at Cambridge, as he had done among the blue coats, in spite of irregularities. The only danger was that the incalculable tendencies in him might be fatally timed, and that his good intentions might be frustrated by some act which was not due to habit, but to capricious, scattered impulses. He could not be said to have any one bad habit, yet at longer or shorter intervals he had fits of impish recklessness, and did things that would have made the worst habits. Hans, in his right mind, however, was a lovable creature, and in Deronda he had happened to find a friend who was likely to stand by him with the more constancy, from compassion for these brief aberrations that might bring a long repentance. Hans indeed shared Deronda's rooms nearly as much as he used his own. To Deronda he poured himself out on his studies, his affairs, his hopes, the poverty of his home, and his love for the creatures there, the itching of his fingers to draw, and his determination to fight it away for the sake of getting some sort of a plum that he might divide with his mother and the girls. He wanted no confidence in return, but seemed to take Deronda as an Olympian who needed nothing, an egotism in friendship which is common enough with mercurial, expansive natures. Deronda was content, and gave Meyrick all the interest he claimed, getting at last a brotherly anxiety about him, looking after him in his erratic moments, and contriving by adroitly delicate devices not only to make up for his friend's lack of pence, but to save him from threatening chances. Such friendship easily becomes tender. The one spreads strong sheltering wings that delight in spreading, the other gets the warm protection which is also a delight. Meyrick was going in for a classical scholarship, and his success, in various ways momentous, was the more probable from the steadying influence of Deronda's friendship. But an imprudence of Meyrick's, committed at the beginning of the autumn term, threatened to disappoint his hopes. With his usual alternation between unnecessary expense and self-privation, he had given too much money for an old engraving which fascinated him, and to make up for it, had come from London in a third-class carriage with his eyes exposed to a bitter wind and any irritating particles the wind might drive before it. The consequence was a severe inflammation of the eyes, which for some time hung over him the threat of a lasting injury. This crushing trouble called out all Deronda's readiness to devote himself, and he made every other occupation secondary to that of being companion and eyes to Hans, working with him and for him at his classics, that if possible his chance of the classical scholarship might be saved. Hans, to keep the knowledge of his suffering from his mother and sisters, alleged his work as a reason for passing the Christmas at Cambridge, and his friend stayed up with him. Meanwhile Deronda relaxed his hold on his mathematics, and Hans, reflecting on this, at length said, "Old fellow, while you are hoisting me, you are risking yourself. With your mathematical cram one may be like Moses or Mahomet or somebody of that sort who had to cram, and forgot in one day what it had taken him 40 to learn." Deronda would not admit that he cared about the risk, and he had really been beguiled into a little indifference by double sympathy. He was very anxious that Hans should not miss the much-needed scholarship, and he felt a revival of interest in the old studies. Still, when Hans, rather late in the day, got able to use his own eyes, Deronda had tenacity enough to try hard and recover his lost ground. He failed, however, but he had the satisfaction of seeing Meyrick win. Success as a sort of beginning that urged completion might have reconciled Deronda to his university course, but the emptiness of all things, from politics to pastimes, is never so striking to us as when we fail in them. The loss of the personal triumph had no severity for him, but the sense of having spent his time ineffectively in a mode of working which had been against the grain, gave him a distaste for any renewal of the process, which turned his imagined project of quitting Cambridge into a serious intention. In speaking of his intention to Meyrick, he made it appear that he was glad of the turn events had taken, glad to have the balance dip decidedly, and feel freed from his hesitations, but he observed that he must of course submit to any strong objection on the part of Sir Hugo. Meyrick's joy and gratitude were disturbed by much uneasiness. He believed in Deronda's alleged preference, but he felt keenly that in serving him Daniel had placed himself at a disadvantage in Sir Hugo's opinion, and he said mournfully, "If you had got the scholarship, Sir Hugo would have thought that you asked to leave us with a better grace. You have spoiled your luck for my sake, and I can do nothing to amend it." "Yes, you can. You are a first-rate fellow. I call that a first-rate investment of my luck." "Oh, confound it! You save an ugly mongrel from drowning and expect him to cut a fine figure. The poets have made tragedies enough about signing one's self over to wickedness for the sake of getting something plummy. I shall write a tragedy of a fellow who signed himself over to be good, and was uncomfortable ever after." But Hans lost no time in secretly writing the history of the affair to Sir Hugo, making it plain that but for Deronda's generous devotion he could hardly have failed to win the prize he had been working for. The two friends went up to town together, Meyrick to rejoice with his mother and the girls in their little home at Chelsea, Deronda to carry out the less easy task of opening his mind to Sir Hugo. He relied a little on the baronet's general tolerance of eccentricities, but he expected more opposition than he met with. He was received with even warmer kindness than usual. The failure was passed over lightly, and when he detailed his reasons for wanting to quit the university and go to study abroad, Sir Hugo sat for some time in a silence which was rather meditative than surprised. At last he said, looking at Daniel with examination, "So you don't want to be an English gentleman to the backbone after all?" "I want to be an Englishman, but I want to understand other points of view, and I want to get rid of a merely English attitude in studies." "I see. You don't want to be turned out in the same mold as every other youngster. And I have nothing to say against your doffing some of our national prejudices. I feel the better myself for having spent a good deal of my time abroad. But for God's sake keep an English cut, and don't become indifferent to bad tobacco. And my dear boy, it is good to be unselfish and generous, but don't carry that too far. It will not do to give yourself to be melted down for the benefit of the tallow trade. You must know where to find yourself. However, I shall put no vote on your going. Wait until I can get off committee, and I'll run over with you." So Deronda went according to his will, but not before he had spent some hours with Hans Meyrick and been introduced to the mother and sisters in the Chelsea home. The shy girls watched and registered every look of their brother's friend, declared by Hans to have been the salvation of him, a fellow like nobody else, and in fine, a brick. They so thoroughly accepted Deronda as an ideal that when he was gone the youngest set to work, under the criticism of the two elder girls, to paint him as Prince Camaralzaman. End of chapter 16. This recording is in the public domain.